Welcome to everybody. And what I want to talk about tonight is the origin of animals, this event that we call the Cambrian Explosion, and really look at what we mean by that, and then focus in on one particular locality that, as Jack says, I've spent quite a bit of time looking at as part of my Greenland research. So you'll be familiar with these references to the first animals exhibition, now sadly behind locked doors in the Museum of Natural History in Oxford, but fortunately it's all available online. And if you want to explore the fossils that I'm going to talk about and the environments that I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail, then go and have a look at that website. It has most of the exhibition content, and I'll repeat that URL at the end of the lecture. So what we're going to talk about tonight is not a new question. I wouldn't pretend that. In fact, it was one that Darwin identified. When Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, in November 1859, just 6 months before the museum opened in Oxford, he recognised a real difficulty that the fossil record posed for him with his new theory of evolution by natural selection. And that is, as he said, there is another and allied difficulty which is much graver. I allude to the manner in which numbers of species of the same group suddenly appear in the lowest known fossiliferous rocks. So what he was trying to say with that was that clearly there must be some evolution that's missing in the rock record if multiple numbers of species of the same group appear at the same time rather than spaced out through time and through the rock record. So it was a problem that Darwin was never able to solve in his lifetime, and on and off it's occupied scientists ever since 1859, but with a real acceleration in the last few decades, and a huge amount of research effort has been put onto this question of the origin of species. And really, just in the past couple of years, I think we've begun to make some real inroads into understanding what the questions are and what the different answers to those different questions are. So if we think of a modern marine ecosystem, if we think of a place on the planet with great animal diversity, we might think of something like this, a modern reef with lots of different species of fish, very visibly, of vertebrate animals, the group to which we belong, but also of corals, and lurking in those crevices and crypts, a lot of other species representing different animal groups. But if we go back before the Cambrian, it's very different. For the first 3 billion years of Earth history, an equivalent photograph to that would have looked something like this. It's a microbial film growing on a sediment surface, and you might be able to see that there are little pustules, these little bumps that are visible, and that's where decay gases from older mats, as they rot away, are pushing up against the undersurface of the mat. That's methane bubbling away. But there are also other bubbles, one here, and that's a bubble of oxygen being released by photosynthesis. So these are photosynthesizing microbial mats created by cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae as we used to call them, and they're building these films. As storms rip across that surface, they rip up flakes of the sediment and transport them. So it's beginning to turn into rock, it's beginning to semi-lithify, certainly consolidate, such that it can be reworked by current action. And that was it. That was marine ecosystems for the better part of 3 billion years, until animals came along and changed things really radically. And now these sorts of microbial systems are not very common. They're present in just a few places around the world. You might ask how we've got a photograph of a Precambrian ecosystem. This is actually a puddle in the English Lake District, a long-term puddle that doesn't dry out and just happens to mimic those environments, so we can get an understanding of the processes that happen. But if we go to the rock record and have a look at what the rocks tell us, we've got similar features. So these are now Precambrian rocks on the east coast of Greenland, at about 74 degrees north, on an island called Elleø. And these are microbial films. This time, they've actually grown into a reef. So we can get quite complex structures developed from microbes and bacteria. And if we zoom in, that stick is a meter long, the yellow stick. If we zoom in, we can see that in detail, what we've got is a series of columns of these bacteria competing with each other and as films and growing up towards the sunlight to capture as much sunlight as possible for their photosynthesis. So this is typical of rocks about 800 million years ago. And if we zoom back out of that scene, what we've got here is a pretty complete succession from 800 million years ago up to about 450 million years, what we would call the Ordovician. So we go through the end part of the Precambrian, into the Cambrian, and those distant hills are the lower part of the Ordovician. And it's tropical limestones almost as far as the eye can see, except for this cliff here and this cliff here. And in those two cliffs, something very different happens that is really significant to our story. Because in those cliffs, we have rocks like these, not looking very limestoney at all. These are actually tillites. They're the deposits from glaciers, and the red blocks that you can see are granites. The grey blocks are limestones. The slightly yellowy coloured blocks are sandstones. They've all been scooped up by glaciers and deposited. So what we're looking at here is a major glacial event, similar to the one that happened in the Northern Hemisphere until 10,000 years ago. But if we map these localities out, they're absolutely global. And it's an event that we call, as it says there, Snowball Earth. And reconstructions of Snowball Earth events look something like this: an entirely snowy planet. There's a bit of debate over how much open water there is. In fact, there's a paper out just this week arguing there was probably rather more open water and less glaciation than many people have thought. But to all intents and purposes, the planet locked solid for tens of millions of years. It's actually really difficult to unlock when you do that. What you need to do, or what the planet needs to do, is wait until enough volcanic heat builds up from mid-ocean ridges, and that gradually builds enough of a temperature differential, because as a frozen planet, it bounces off all of the sunlight, and so there's very little heat gain from solar radiation. So if we look at the geological record of these Snowball Earth events, we begin to see an interesting pattern. They really terminate this long period of microbial dominance that's gone on for 3 billion years. There are three main events at the end of the Precambrian: the Sturtian from 720 to about 660 million years, the Marinoan from 650 to 635. That rock section that I showed you was Sturtian with Marinoan on top, and that close-up of the rock was the Marinoan. And they're global events. They're genuinely global events. There's a third glacial event, the Gasquiers, which is less global, but still a really significant glaciation event. And that's at 580, and that leaves a gap of just 40 million years between the Gasquiers and the base of the Cambrian. And it's in that interval, as we've heard in earlier lectures, that the interesting things begin to happen. We begin to see fossils like these, and these are the first evidence of really abundant multicellular life existing in quite complex ecosystems. And we heard Jack Matthews talk about these in the first lecture of the series, and then Frankie Dunn talk about them a few lectures ago. And they've been very enigmatic for a long period of time, for many decades since their first discovery. But there's now increasing evidence that these are actually primitive animals. And one of the lines of evidence comes from Frankie Dunn's work that she talked about a few weeks ago, looking at how these organisms grow and then relating them to the growth patterns of animals alive today. And using that technique of developmental biology, Frankie was able to determine that the overwhelmingly most likely position on the evolutionary tree for these Ediacarans, as we call them, organisms, multicellular organisms from Ediacaran time, is that they sit down at the base of the animal tree. And there are other lines of supporting evidence, including preserved organic molecules, that are beginning to back that hypothesis up. If we roll on a little bit further through the Ediacaran, through that post-gaseous glaciation time, we then begin to see things like this. These are animal burrows, and from their pattern, we think that they must have been made by organisms, worm-like organisms, that have a plane of bilateral symmetry down the middle of the body, like ourselves. So that's the majority of animals, except for jellyfish and anemones and things like that, and sponges. So some evidence of slightly more advanced animals beginning to come in as we creep towards the end of the Ediacaran. And then, as we heard in the last lecture from Duncan Murdoch, right at the end of the Ediacaran, we begin to see evidence for animals making shells and making what we call biominerals, making crystalline inorganic mineral as part of their metabolism for either protection and or predation. So if we put all that together into a single overview of geological time, this is quite an old diagram now, but it still holds true in its essence, that immediately after the gaseous glaciation, we get the incoming of the Ediacaran biota, the Ediacaran fauna, and at least some of those are animals. We can be pretty sure of that. Then a few million years before the base of the Cambrian, we get the first trace fossils that we think were made by animals. And then we begin to get animals with skeletons coming in the last few million years, right before the Cambrian. So you might ask, if we've got good evidence for animals prior to the base of the Cambrian, what's the big fuss? Why is it called the Cambrian Explosion? What is the Cambrian Explosion? It's an event that replaces environments like this. This is a reconstruction that was part of the exhibition by Martin Lysek of that Newfoundland biota that Frankie and Jack have described. And here we've got these early animals sitting on microbial mats, still very microbial mat dominated, in quite deep water. And they're replaced by really quite dynamic ecosystems at the base of the Cambrian. And so we can define the Cambrian explosion in a number of different ways. In green here, we've got the labeled EB, we've got the Ediacarans, the Ediacaran biota, and they have a reasonable number of different species, taxa, particularly towards the end of their time range. But then look at that really abrupt transition into the Cambrian. Phyla, animal phyla, really reflect the highest level of body organization. They, for example, our own group is the chordata. The echinoderms includes the sea urchins and the starfish. And they're unified by very, very broadly similar anatomies. At the next level down, classes, we're looking at still very distinct groups of organisms. But for example, the sea urchins form a class, the starfish form a class, the vertebrates, our own group, form a class. So what we can think of when we think of the numbers of phyla and classes is the number of different body plans that are present. And what we can see as we cross into the Cambrian is a sudden explosion in the number of different body plans that are present. So it's a spurt in evolution. It's not the origin of animals, but it's the establishment of many of the body plans that we recognize at the modern day when we go down to the beach or when we go to an aquarium. And you'll notice that that increase very much stabilizes as we go through the Cambrian and into the Ordovician. And since the Ordovician, there have been very few new phyla or classes added at all to the animal complement. So that's one way of looking at the Cambrian explosion. Another way is to think of it in terms of ecosystem change. So we talked in that reconstruction by Martin Lysek of the Ediacaran biota on the left, sitting pre-542 million years ago at the base of the Cambrian, sitting on these microbial mats, a largely passive existence. There were some that could move across that sediment surface, but not many. Crossed the Cambrian boundary, and as it says here, they gave it the fancy title of the agronomic substrate revolution. What it basically means is that animals become much more dynamic, and the interactions between animals become much more dynamic. We get organisms burrowing down into the sediments and beginning to engineer the sediment. We get animals swimming up into the water column, and these are newly evolved lifestyles that are associated with the Cambrian explosion. Another way of looking at it is to focus in on those trace fossils, those burrows, and the way that organisms interact with the sediment. And that's something that Gabriele Mangano, who will talk later on in this lecture series, did in a paper a few weeks ago, looking at the number of different trace fossils that we get as we go from low down in the Precambrian, crossing into the Cambrian, and look at the number of different trace fossils that begin to appear and the way that they're beginning to engineer the substrate. They're beginning to bioengineer their own habitats. And that enables a number of different processes to interact, and it increases the diversity of organisms that can live in those spaces. Another way, this is quite a complex diagram, but I'll just steer you through the essentials. Another way of looking at it is in terms of the different ways that animals build their skeletons that we've just mentioned. And this was what Duncan Murdoch talked about in the last lecture. So here we've got geological time from oldest on the left, the bar at the bottom, through to youngest on the right. And we got an evolutionary tree of different animal groups sitting on its side above that. And the different coloured bars represent different types of mineral that animals use. And it's a painstaking assembly of a big data set. But what we can tell from this is, A, that biomineralisation, the creation of skeletons, happened multiple times. Different groups chose different minerals in an evolutionary sense. Some chose calcite, like starfish. Some, like ourselves, chose calcium phosphate, apatite. A few, like the sponges, chose silica. Very few animal groups, once they've made that evolutionary choice, remake that choice. It becomes entrained in their developmental biology. And so if organisms begin to make their skeletons out of apatite, they carry on making out of apatite. And we can actually break it down still further into different types of calcite as well, different types of calcium carbonate. And one of the other points is that the evidence of the use of hard tissues of skeletons for predation appears at more or less exactly the same time as that for protection. So it's a co-evolution. It's an evolutionary arms race between hard tissues evolving for predation and hard tissues evolving for protection. So that's another way of looking at the Cambrian explosion. And these are all equally valid ways of defining the Cambrian explosion. Most recently, people have begun to think of it not in terms of individual aspects, but of really looking at a unified interdisciplinary approach. And again, this is by Rachel Wood, who will talk later on in the lecture series. And what she's done with Phil Donoghue and other co-authors is try and unite different data sets to look at patterns and processes across the base of the Cambrian, the base of fauna, the Phanerozoic, as it says here, the top linear Proterozoic on the left. So what she's trying to do here is unite the evidence we've got from genes on the left, informing us about evolutionary trees and about the timing of the origins of groups, with geochemical evidence in the middle, with the sedimentary evidence, the burrowing evidence indicated by the bioturbation index, with the fossil evidence, the Lagerstätte and the exceptionally preserved fossils. And if we begin to look at the interaction of all those processes, we're likely to get a much better understanding of the dynamics of the Cambrian explosion. This is something that Dave Harper and I tried to do a few years ago. And in In the green boxes, we've got biological processes. In the blue boxes, we've got geochemical processes, and in the red boxes, we've got geological processes. And although it's a very complex diagram, what it indicates is that all of these processes are interacting, and they're interacting via what we call feedback loops, where the process goes round and round and begins to amplify the signal. So this is another way of these interacting processes of looking at the Cambrian explosion. How can we get evidence for all of this? What are the lines of evidence? Well, one of the key tools that we have is that we're very fortunate in the Cambrian to have a lot of localities with exceptionally preserved fossils, and that's really the theme of the first animals exhibition. We call them Lagerstätte, the same word that informs the beer, lager, storage and preservation. There are many localities, and I've just chosen some of the key ones here. We'll hear about the Burgess Shale from Derek Briggs in a few weeks' time, and about the Chengjiang, which is also part of the exhibition, also in a few weeks' time. But what I want to do is focus today on the least well known of these Lagerstätte, the Sirius Passet biota of Greenland. This is a picture from the locality, an exquisitely beautiful spot right up on the north coast of Greenland. Discovered at about the same time as the Chengjiang biota, but far less known because people have been able to visit it much less often and get much less material out. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about where it is, the discovery, and how we built up knowledge about the Sirius Passet Lagerstätte. Many people will be familiar with the story of the discovery of, or at least the apocryphal story of the discovery of the Burgess Shale exceptional preserved deposit, when a geologist's horse, Charles Doolittle Walcott's horse, stumbled and he found the fossils, and he traced them up the hill and found the locality that they were coming from. The discovery of the Sirius Passet Lagerstätte is not quite so romantic, but it's a story worth looking at. This is where the locality is, right up on the northern tip of Greenland. There's virtually no land further north than Sirius Passet. There's a tiny little bit of Greenland and the smallest sliver of Canada on the northern coast of Ellesmere Island. But the rest is just frozen Arctic Ocean right the way out to the North Pole. If we zoom in on that bit of land at the northern tip of Greenland, it's difficult to comprehend the scale, actually. The locality is over here. This is Sirius Passet, indicated by the red dot. The nearest human habitation is Station Nord, right over on the east coast. That's a weather station, and that's actually 400 kilometers away. So those are the nearest human beings. There's Alert in Ellesmere Island is about the same distance, and then going northwards, the North Pole is about twice that distance, going off the top of the diagram from the red dot on the left to the red dot on the right. It's about 800 kilometers to the North Pole. The Sirius Passet locality is situated in the world's largest national park, and this next slide gives you a bit of a feel for the scale of the terrain we're looking at. So the Northeast Greenland National Park is a shade over 970,000 square kilometers. It occupies the red area of Greenland. Difficult to envisage, of course, what 970,000 square kilometers looks like. But if I was to tell you that red area is equivalent to the area of France, plus Germany, plus the Netherlands, plus Belgium, that gives you a feel for the scale of the Northeast Greenland National Park. And it's relatively recently explored. The early exploration was summarized by Lagerstätte in a beautiful series of maps in 1940. And he looked at the survey of North Greenland, and this was his summary of the total knowledge of the north coast of Greenland. And you'll see that the coastlines were beginning to emerge. At this point, probably only 10 people had ever been to this locality, surveying it and mapping it. Of course, there'd been lots of indigenous peoples who passed across this area at earlier stages. But the map was only just beginning to come together in 1914. You'll see that our red dot is plonked right in the middle of a blank piece of land. And it was only really with the advent of aerial photography and then satellite imaging that we've really begun to get detailed maps of this area. The Sirius Passet fossils were found by these two gentlemen, and they were found during the systematic geological surveying of North Greenland that I was fortunate to be part of just after my PhD. Tony Higgins, a British geologist, but based for most of his career at the Geological Survey of Greenland in Copenhagen, a structural geologist, but one with a really encyclopedic knowledge of geology, just as happy doing basin analysis and sedimentology as he was making structural geology maps. And he was working with Jack Soper, who's as well known to the rock climbing community. He basically was one of the founders of modern rock climbing. But also in the 1960s was part of one of the last great heroic sledge survey expeditions, sledging around the north coast of Greenland, making a geological map as they went. And they were working together. And over the radio one evening in July 1984, we heard them very excitedly saying that they'd found fossils and that they'd found a load of trilobites and a bunch of grass. We tried to decipher what the bunch of grass might be in fossil terms. It definitely wasn't a bunch of grass. It turned out actually to be a sponge. And so Jack went back the next season in 1985 and collected some bulk samples. And on the back of those bulk samples, Tony went back in 1985. And on the back of those samples, John Peel in Copenhagen, one of the paleontologists at the Greenland survey at that time, recognized soft-bodied fossils with preserved soft tissue in a similar style to the Burgess Shale. And that led them, John Peel, to get the money together for an expedition to go and collect the Sirius Passet locality for the first time. And that expedition took place in 1989, and I was part of that expedition. There was a bit of a logistical challenge. The Geological Survey was mapping 1,000 kilometers further south on the east coast, so we were really stretched in terms of the logistics. We knew that there was a little landing strip here, but the locality, as you can see from the red dot, is over here. That's 25 kilometers away. So if we could only land at that Brenaardsund airstrip, we would have to take all the equipment 25 kilometers across what became known as Sirius Passet. It didn't have a name at that time. And then all of the fossils all the way back again. So we were quite keen to find an alternative solution. And that's where the Icelandic pilots of the Twin Otter aircraft, short takeoff and landing aircraft, really came into the fore, because we took all the equipment off at Brenaardsund and then went looking for a locality where we might be able to get the Twin Otter down with the equipment. And we circled round, we circled round, we circled round. The pilot would go in on a likely looking strip and thump the wheels in to see whether it would support the weight of the aircraft when it was landing, put the engines back on, spiral around, thump in. One of the more nauseating experiences of my life. And in the end, they told us to hang on, and they landed the plane and it clattered to a halt in literally 50 meters. Now, normally, if we're working in these remote areas, the ideal solution, as we had last summer, was to work with helicopters. But this time we only had the Twin Otter aircraft to support us. So that meant that we had to get both in and out using the Twin Otter aircraft. And the place the Icelandic pilots managed to land it was right on the limits of what these things can land on. Now, you might think this is an artfully posed photograph with holding the camera at a tricky angle. But if you look, the pilot is standing perfectly upright, and it's the plane that is a slightly wonky, tilted to the right, landing uphill angle. They managed to get us down, but it was made clear to us that there was no way that they'd be able to land there again and take us off with all of the rock. So one of the next challenges was that not only did we have to find the locality, but we had to build an airstrip before we could get back out again as well. The locality we knew was somewhere in those hills in the far distance, but it was pre-GPS days and we didn't have an extremely precise fix on where it was. So the plane dumped us with all of our gear, about a ton of equipment. And here's John Peel, who raised the money and led the expedition, waving a fond farewell. And then we had to get all of our equipment across to a camp where we might be able to build an airstrip. This was the photograph of the team, and the team for this first exploration was John Peel on the left, then of the Geological Survey of Greenland, but later University of Uppsala. In the white coat, Simon Conway-Morris, University of Cambridge. In the middle, next to Simon, Paul Schuller, who at that time was with the Geological Survey of Greenland as well, but later went to work for the Geological Survey of New Zealand. And then me on the right. And that's about a ton of equipment surrounding us that we had to get across to the locality before we could be picked up. So this is an indication of the terrain. The locality is really easy to spot on aerial photographs. It's this black and white stripe over on the right-hand side that you can see there. And the plane put down, it doesn't look far, it's only 5 or 6 kilometers, but you'll notice that there's a somewhat substantial river that comes down between the two and builds this big delta here, and quite a lot of water spilling out and melting the ice in the fjord. So we then had to navigate that. The river's not insubstantial, particularly in the middle of the day when the melt is at its highest. And that's a very perplexed, hands in pockets, me wondering how on earth we were going to get across. John Peel had come up with a fantastic plan of building what he called tundra trolleys. We took them up, broken down, and were able to quickly assemble them. And it turned out that these were quite a good way of getting across the terrain. They're not ideal for getting across big rivers. So the only way to do it was basically heft. We spent an entire day, my notebook says that we spent 8 hours of continuous work to move the camp 200 meters. And it really was absolutely exhausting work, because once we got to the other side of the river, we then had to get it up the hill on the left-hand side on those trolleys. Once we were on the top of there, it was relatively easy going. And within a few days, we were able to find a nice horizontal camping spot. That's the first of the trolleys that we dragged across. And we were then able to go and actually excitedly look for the Sirius Passet locality up on the hill above. So this is us on the very first morning, heading up the hill in the vague direction of the locality that Tony Higgins had described to us, not knowing exactly where to look and just combing the scree as we went for any fossils. And as it turns out, the very, very first fossil we found is one of the most iconic Sirius Passet fossils. As we were walking across some scree, we noticed this particular specimen. And we now know it's a very primitive mollusk, but a very unusual mollusk. It's got a shell at either end and these calcium carbonate spicules covering the body. So it's a slug-like animal, maybe 5 or 6 centimeters long, and was really the sign that we'd honed in on the locality. And this was the locality in 1989, a really snowy place, working underneath this overhanging cornice that kept breaking away. And a pretty chilly place to work as well. And it could not look more different these days. This is us trudging up to the locality a little bit later on in the expedition. And the locality is over here, over on this hill. But you can see that this isn't just a temporary, there is a recent snowstorm in this photograph, but most of it is unmelted seasonal snow. And now the locality looks like this. It's grassy. The snow is more or less all gone. There's virtually no permanent snow. You can see for scale Jakob Winter from University of Bristol just beginning to carry down some fossils there. And so 20 years of rapid polar melting and climate change really has changed Sirius Passet beyond all recognition. But it was a pretty snowy, cold expedition, and that meant lots of time sat in the tent. So again, the expedition team, Paul Schuller, John Peel, me, and Simon Conway Morrison, you notice the old Greenland hands, get the end of the tent that A has the candle and B has the bottle of whiskey. And then as the weather improved, there was still the small matter of building a runway so that we could get out of there before the winter arrived. And so one of the unlikelier entries on my CV is runway construction, airstrip construction. But that really opened up the locality for future visits, because now we had a camp with good water supply, we had an airstrip right next to the camp, and it was a couple of kilometres walk and 400 metres of ascent up to that next locality, up to the locality. And this is the runway a few years ago, ready to receive a door-to-door service of Twin Otter, more or less landing on top of the tent and picking our gear up. The next time I was able to go up was 2009. In the interim, John Peel and Simon Conway Morris went back in 1991 and 1994, and then another short trip in 2006. And we went up in 2009 and 2011. And a South Korean team with Jakob Winter and University of Copenhagen had been up in 2016-17. So, but still only 8 short trips up to Siriuspasset, which is why we know it not as well as the other Cambrian, Lagerstätte. So, some geology, back to some geology. We took a systematic approach in 2006 and 2009 that's been carried on in the later expeditions. A mythology had arisen that you could only find the fossils in the scree, which is not true. They're just as abundant, but slightly harder work to get out of the solid rock. So whilst Jakob Winter on the right scours for exceptionally preserved fossils, Emma Hammerlund on the left, our geochemist at the University of Lund in 2011, is logging a section with me, and as we construct the sedimentary log, she's collecting the geochemical samples that would be critical to our understanding of the environment in which the Siriuspasset animals were living, and which we will come on to. And then once the section was logged, it was basically rock breaking, chain gang stuff. And so this is the main expedition in 2011. Emma Hammerlund on the left, Martin Stein, Arne Torto Nielsen, head down in the blue jacket, Jan Auden Rasmussen, Jakob Valler, and Dave Harper recording the notes, and around the corner, sitting on the naughty step, Jakob Winter. So that was a big team that meant we were able to make a lot of progress and really begin to tear apart the Siriuspasset locality, both in terms of its fossils, but also in terms of its paleo environments. And this just gives you a feel for the field work. But still, we're able to take out relatively small volumes of rock because we're constrained by Twin Otter payload. So what fossils occur at Siriuspasset? This is, in a way, one of my favourites because it's emblematic of Siriuspasset. Halkieria, the fossil I showed you first, is the poster child of the Siriuspasset locality. But of the soft-bodied organisms that have real detail in their anatomy, Arthroaspis here with a 20-centimetre notebook for scale is perhaps really emblematic of that locality. And this is just a composite plate of the range of organisms. This is the trilobite, Buonellus higginsi, named after Tony Higgins, who discovered the locality. These are the sponges that were probably the bunch of grass. And what I want to do is just take you through some of the components of the fauna to give you a flavour from it. As it says there are 45 species and counting, but one of the tricks that paleontologists use is to create what's called a collector curve, to see whether you're beginning to you're still collecting, but you're not finding new species. And we're still at the point where we're finding new species. So there is more to come out of Siriuspasset, that's for sure. It's not just that it's a faunally depauperate locality. It may not be as diverse as Burgess Shale and Chengjiang, but it's certainly more diverse than 45 species. This is a reconstruction, first of all, of Halkieria, just to show you, how slug-like it is, with this armoured upper surface and this foot on the undersurface, mouth on the right. And we'll look at where that was living and how that was making, how it was getting its nutrition in just a moment. One of the other common fossils of the soft-bodied fossils, those, when we talk about soft-bodied fossils, we mean those that don't have skeletons, mineralized skeletons, are what we call logopods. They're most closely related to Peripatus, the velvet worms at the modern day. And on the left and on the right, we've got two of the different lobopod genera and species. We've been able to add more detail to Kerrig-McKeeler from material that we collected on the recent expedition. That's allowed a revised anatomical reconstruction that you can see here, that we published in Nature Communications a couple of years ago. Of course, one of the most figured organisms that you see in both the Burgess Shale and Chengjiang are the anomalocarids, here illustrated with Lagania. And these were the apex predators of Cambrian seas, growing up to 1 meter, 2 meters long, with this radial mouth. They belong to a group called the radiodonts, and these appendages stuffing food into the mouth. But not all anomalocarids were fierce. And the one that is being described by Jakob and colleagues from Sirius Passet is actually very different in terms of its feeding mode to that. You'll see on the left that it's got these feathery appendages that stick off the main arm of the appendage, and that this appendage could be flexed and curled up. And the reconstruction that Jakob and colleagues thought most appropriate was that actually it's using these as a mobile sieve, and that Ediacaran was actually the Cambrian equivalent of a baleen whale, that it was wafting these giant appendages through the water, sifting out plankton and putting them back into the mouth. And then swimming alongside, we have some of the other characteristic organisms of Sirius Passet. So Ediacaran was large and multi-meter long. And gigantism is something that we see in Sirius Passet and other Cambrian localities. This is a thing called Sirillorica, described by John Peel. It's most closely, its closest living relatives that we will be familiar with are things like nematode worms. Belongs to a group called the loriciferans. But the thing about loriciferans at the modern day is that they're tiny. If you look at this scale bar down here, oops, try again. Scale bar down here, that's 25 microns, 25 thousandths of a millimeter, whereas Sirillorica is tens of centimeters long. So the Cambrian representative, although anatomically really very, very similar, is orders of magnitude bigger. The group that was swimming alongside Ediacaran is the group that I'm perhaps most interested in Sirius Passet, the Vetulicolians. Been a lot of debate about what they're most closely related to. Here we have, on the left, we've got a species that Jakob, Dave Harper and I described in 2011, Ediacaran, and it's a very characteristic Vetulicolian. We've got these gill slits opening down the side. We've got a large oral opening, a large mouth. So we think that the water was flowing in through the mouth and then out through these gill slits. But at the back of that chamber is a tail that we can see is segmented and capable of flexing. So we think that this was capable of free swimming as the model by Esmond Horn in 10 tons indicates on the right. And here for comparison is an example from Chengjiang. So this is where vetulicolians were first described from. And you can see very clearly here the oral opening as this slit has been flattened on the left, and here are the gill slits where the water would come out. So this thing was taking in large volumes of water. Again, it was filter feeding, and it was almost certainly taking the food out of the water on cilia, on fine hairs that lined those gill openings down the side, but propelling itself through the water column to get the maximum volume of water and food into that chamber, that open chamber. If we reconstruct it, and again, this is one of Martin Lysek's reconstructions of a Chengjiang fossil, this is what it would look like. Some protection at the opening, so the mouth on the right, so it could close it off and protect it. But to feed, it would open those up, and then the gill slits down the side and the mobile tail. The exhibition website also has some lovely animations of vetulicoli swimming and feeding. And these are really quite abundant. They're present in quite large numbers. They haven't been found in the first few expeditions, but once you get a search pattern in your eye, they're quite badly decomposed often. And so we now have many hundreds, and we're in the process of writing those up and describing them. So where were all these animals living? What's the environmental setting that we were trying to understand through that sedimentary logging and geochemical sampling? Well, this is a simplified geological map of North Greenland. The Siriuspasset locality is in J.P. Kop Fjord, which is just here. You can ignore the red box, that's for a different purpose. But the key point, the take-home message from this summary geological diagram is that we can divide the geology into two parts. We've got the pale blue rocks to the south. Now those are Cambrian, Ordovician and Silurian shallow marine deposits, continental shelf deposits, mainly limestones, and deposited in, for the most part, a few tens of meters of water depth. But then we go over the edge of the continental margin onto the continental slope into much, much deeper water, quite abruptly into deeper water. And there we get mainly the deposition of fine-grained sediments and some sediment that is pouring off the edge of the platform. So Siriuspasset is pretty much on the boundary between the continental shelf and the continental slope, or as it says on this diagram, the shelf and the trough. If we draw a cross section pretty much parallel to the eastern side of that red box, it looks something like this. So now we've got a vertical cross section through the Earth's crust and through the sedimentary deposits. And Siriuspasset is located here. So it's right on that flexure as we go from the horizontal continental margin on the left down into the deep water on the right. And you'll see that on the left it's indicated that there are sandstones, there's continental shelf sandstones similar to what's deposited in the Northern Sea and west of the British Isles of the modern day. We then go into finer and finer deposits as we get out of the range of the sediment supply and down into mudstones. And the Siriuspasset locality, I've actually drawn this arrow a bit too high, sits just above that boundary, that transition boundary that we can see there. So it's at a point of transition and a point of change in sediment supply is the first thing that we can conclude. If we zoom in and look at the geological map that we made, you can see that point emphasized. So in pale blue, we've got the older rocks that Siriuspasset is sitting on. The Siriuspasset locality is actually within a geological unit called the Buin Formation. And the Buin Formation itself changes quite radically as it goes over the edge of the continental shelf. So in the south, in yellow, we've got the typical shelf sandstones that we saw in the last diagram. In the north, in the pale green, we've got the trough mudstones. And in the two darker shades of green, we've got the transitional boon, as it's sometimes been called, which is where the Siriuspasset locality is located. And everything's been a bit compressed because it's been scrunched up by later geological activity, but we can still disentangle really quite easily that original depositional relationship, which is much more difficult to do at some other Cambrian localities. So we've got a lot more sedimentary information and paleoenvironmental information to play with. Slightly overprinted by metamorphism, these rocks have been heated up to a few hundred degrees, so the minerals have begun to change, but we can still do the sedimentology. This is the locality looking eastwards. Again, we've got these shelf sandstones of the Bowen in B on the right. We've got the older Portfield limestones, which is what everything sits on. The locality is this black and white stripe here. Then we've got the transitional rocks of the shelf slope break. And then we go out into what are called the Frigfjord mudstones, which are the trough mudstones. If we just zoom in on the locality itself, this is what it looks like. So this is the Siriuspasset locality. You can see here the small quarry that has been opened up to extract the fossils and to measure the sedimentary section. These arrows here are actually younging arrows, and they V in the younging direction. So in the white rocks, these are younging upwards. That's as you would expect rocks to be. The Siriuspasset locality is actually upside down. It's been inverted by this later geological activity, but we can still read the rocks pretty easily. And this is what the locality looked like on that first trip before we began digging away at it. So we can see the rib of the most fossiliferous material heading down the hill to Simon Conway Morris in the blue down jacket. And if we zoom in on that sediment, it looks something like this. It's pretty undistinguished as sediment goes. They're very thin, platy, dark grey to black mudstones. But one of the really distinctive things is that they're coated in these yellow powders. And these are iron oxides and hydroxides that are the result of the oxidation of pyrites, iron sulfide. And that's a really key part of our story. So we put all of that together into a sedimentary log. It looks like this. It's a very thin section, and the fossiliferous section is even thinner. So you can see that in the darkest browns, those are mudstones, going through to the palest brown siltstones, through intermediate silty mudstones and muddy siltstones. For those of us who make sedimentary logs, this is about as dull as it gets, frankly, but really informative in terms of the environment. You'll see that in the label, I've mentioned that there are abundant microbial mats, and that's a key feature of the locality. In red, we've got the horizons from which soft tissues are recovered. And in yellow, we've got where these rusty sediments are, these yellow powders. And on the extreme right, we've got what the sediment looks like, as we've just seen. But then at the bottom right, a thin section through one of these individual mudstone layers. And you'll see that it's white and black stripe, but that from where my pen is now, up to here, it goes from black, a sharp base black, white, gradationally into black. And what that's telling us geologically is that these are quartz grains, and those quartz grains are progressively replaced by mud. So in other words, we would say that this is fining upwards. And that's indicative to geologists of decelerating currents. And we interpret this as being the result of sediment slurries that are going across the continental shelf, perhaps kicked up by storms, and depositing these very thin, millimeter thick horizons, but they're transporting animals with them as well. So that leads us into a distinction in the fossils that we find at Sirius Passet. We can identify, as I mentioned, microbial mats, and these are readily recognized by the fact that we can see burrows running parallel to the mat, so horizontal burrows that pop up and go down up through the mats. And if they're going underneath the mats, they pop the mat up, just like Jerry would in a Tom and Jerry cartoon. But then if they pop up onto the mat surface, they make grooves. So you can see that this is a positive relief burrow, this is a negative relief burrow, and that's and we can see the transition from one type to the other as we follow burrow traces. These often occur around fossils. They seem to invade any decaying organic matter. You might just be able to see in this picture segmentation. This is one of those large Arthroaspis arthropods that I showed you a few slides ago. Now, living on those microbial mats is a very distinctive fauna that we call the Microbial Mat Guild. So top right, we've got one of these distinctive Arthroaspis being mined for its nutrients by these burrows, the worms making these burrows. We've got polychaete worms that are living on the burrows, not burrowing into it, no vertical burrowing. Here we've got one of the Arthroaspis in the middle, a Halkieria, almost certainly grazing on the microbial mat, top left, and then a sponge sitting and filter feeding on the mat, bottom left. So that's what we call the Microbial Mat Guild, and they're preserved at the base of these little storm layers, underneath the coarsest sediment. They're smothered, they're killed by the input of these plumes of sediment from the storms. Within the thin sediment layers carried by the storms are the rest of what we might call the typical Cambrian fauna. We've got bits of Anomalocaris, the Ediacaran that we mentioned. We've got free-swimming polychaete annelids. We've got vetulicolians, free-swimming vetulicolians, but it's also ripping up burrowers as well, and some things living on the surface. So these are preserved in a much more typical Burgess shale type way than the things that are living on the mats, which tend to be preserved more in 3 dimensions. We can then tie that preservation into the geochemistry, and this is quite a complex diagram, but I just want to focus with this column on the left, next to the sedimentary log. So by looking at a number of deposits, a technique has been developed to calibrate what's called the FeHR, the highly reactive iron, to FeT, total iron ratio. So iron in sediments occurs in lots of different forms, but the highly reactive form of iron is the iron that occurs in the oxides, the hydroxides, and the sulfides. Now, that's used as a proxy for the oxygenation of the water column. If the FeHR FeT ratio is more than 0.38, we can say that that water column where the sediment is effectively without oxygen. It's what we would call anoxic. Between 0.2 and 0.38, it's very low in oxygen. We would say that's hypoxic or dysoxic. You'll see both terms on slides coming up. And you'll see that the fauna that's living there and being transported a short distance, we don't think any of the fauna is traveling very far, is quite frequently within that low oxygen interval. And the low oxygen intervals are indicated by these horizontal rulings. So how does that compare with the distribution of fossils? Well, actually, if we open that diagram out and we look at the abundance of fossils and the diversity in red, so this column here, the abundance, and in red, the diversity, and also the representation of the most common fossils in terms of the number of specimens we were finding per unit rock area, you can see that the peak abundances of fossils are coincident with the anoxic periods. Now, one could say, well, they're just being preserved because of that. Well, that's partly true, but we also have good evidence that they're living there. So these organisms are living in low oxygen environments. That's not so much of a surprise because Emma Hammerlund has also been looking at the Chengjiang deposit in China. And the Chengjiang looks like a beautiful beige limestone, but actually boreholes have shown that it's almost identical sedimentologically to the Sirius Passet. It's these thin storm layers, and the FEHR, FET plots look almost identical to Sirius Passet. These organisms are living and being preserved in low oxygen, very low oxygen environments. If we look at modern oceans, that's quite similar to the sort of situation we find in what are called oxygen minimum zones. They also occur on the edge of continental shelves. Oxygen is entrained into the seawater in the photic zone. It's being produced by photosynthesis. It's also being bashed in by wave action. But as we go out of the light, the depth to which the zone to which light can penetrate through the photic zone, photosynthesis stops. And that means that animals are just using up the oxygen in respiration. There's no new oxygen being generated. And that results in a collapse in oxygen levels. But we still see a very characteristic fauna, as it says on the left, that occupy the margins of oxygen minimum zones. They're frequently quite dense aggregations, quite abundant organisms, but they're low diversity. So they're opportunists who can survive there when not many other organisms can. But they encompass quite a range of different groups. And we think that this is not a bad model, actually, for a comparison with what we're finding at Sirius Passet. And that's quite contrary to a lot of earlier ideas where people speculated that actually an increase in oxygenation oceans was what drove the Cambrian explosion. And now we're beginning to find evidence that actually the inverse is true, that the first animals are preferentially located in terms of their diversity in low oxygen environments. And Emma has explained in this recent paper that shouldn't be so much of a surprise to us, actually. We look at oxygenation from the perspective of successful terrestrial organisms who rely on oxygen. But actually, a large part of the animal kingdom lives in much lower oxygen levels, fringe oxygenated levels. And as Emma says on the left, she calls this the normal world. And actually, it's coping with oxygen that in many ways is what's challenging. And so she then refers to that low oxygen world as being an ancestral niche. And what we are used to is actually the conquered niche. So we shouldn't be too surprised that early animals occur in low oxygen levels. We know, for example, that tumor cells in cancers can withstand very, very low oxygen levels and still thrive. One of the tools that people have looked at to try and cure cancers is to starve cancer cells of their oxygen. But actually, it turns out that they can withstand very, very low oxygen levels. And so maybe we should reverse our thinking of animals and think more about the norm being that they evolved in low oxygen environments. So last few slides, we can put all of that together into an environment in which the Sirius Passet locality is indicated by the red star. It's sitting right at the limit of where sediment transport in these storms would reach. So we've got storms on the shelf, greatly exaggerated gradient. Storms on the sandy shelf, kicking up sediment. It flows out across the very gentle slope below storm wave base into that oxygenated zone. It buries our microbial mats. It preserves our Sirius Passet organisms right at that shelf slope break. So if we look at what was driving the Cambrian evolution and the Cambrian explosion, we can be more or less certain that it wasn't oxygen, because if it was oxygen that was the key control, they will be up on the inner shelf where there was a higher level of oxygen. And yet what we've got is the sediment, the organisms living here and being transported a short distance in to that locality. So they're in, as we've seen, quite a low oxygen environment. If they were primarily driven by nutrient supply, also they will be further into show. They will be within the photic zone where the peak nutrients are. There are a few specialists, some vertical burrowers called scolites that live in the shallow water zone at this time until that we see in northwest Scotland, for example. But one of the things that might be controlling where these early organisms dwell is substrate mobility. It might be that they really weren't very tolerant of mobile substrates that would be moved around by currents, and that they're sitting on microbial mats as just about the most stable substrate. So maybe we should think of Sirius Passet and Chengjiang and other Cambrian Lagerstätte, of other exceptionally preserved Cambrian deposits, as being organisms that lived in deep, dark and rather smelly water, and not the crystal clear tropical waters that you see in some reconstructions. And this rather nice diagram, artwork by Martin Lysett for the exhibition, I think characterizes this for the Chengjiang, but this is pretty much the environment that I would envisage for Sirius Passet as well. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much to Paul for a wonderful, wonderful talk. Do keep your questions coming in on the chat, and we'll try and get as many answered as we can. Before we get onto that, just a reminder that you can find all our previous talks, and indeed Paul's will be up in the next week or so on the museum YouTube channel. I've just put a link in the chat right now. And just a reminder that if you've enjoyed tonight's talk, then do feel free to share that online. Do share the link with friends and family who you think might be interested as well. And then at that point, we will just quickly switch across to that, because we are very pleased to say that we have our schedule sorted for the months to come. So our next talk in 2 weeks' time is going to be by Professor Sarah Gabbett from the University of Leicester, who's going to be talking about some wonderful research that she's done looking at experimental decay and what this tells us about the preservation of fossils. And the link to sign up to that is up already, and I've just popped that up for you. Then 2 weeks later than that, we've got Professor Shuhai Zhao from Virginia Tech. 2 weeks after that, Professor Derek Briggs from Yale. We've got a parade of professors for you. And then as Paul said, September the 9th, Professor Gabriela Mangano from the University of Saskatchewan in Canada will be joining us. And then to wrap it all up, on September the 23rd, we've got Professor Rachel Wood from the University of Edinburgh. Again, you've got a bit of a flavour for what she might talk about from one of the slides tonight, but do put those in your diary. And as we get more details from our speakers, we will put some registration details up on the website, and we'll of course share them at other talks. And just before we get on to answering some of your many questions, just a reminder that we love to get a bit of feedback, and we'd be especially pleased to hear your thoughts on this question. Has this lecture changed your opinion on the evolutionary origin of animals or added to your understanding of the topic? If so, how? And if you've got any thoughts on that, do pop that in the chat. But at this point, let's go to some questions. And I thought we would start with some lovely questions on your field work, because it was a lovely insight into how field work happens in these very challenging areas. So we had some questions from, let's group them all together, or let's do them in two, sorry. We got firstly a question from Morrison. How has the transition from snow to grass because of global warming, has that made it easier or harder to find the fossils that you're after? And Margaret asks a really good question. She's wondering if any of the indigenous people had stories or understanding of the local fossils.
In terms of the ease of finding, I suppose it's what we would say swings and roundabouts. You win some, you lose some. So my overwhelming memory of the early expedition was and the early expeditions at that time was sitting in slightly overcast conditions, really quite cold, you couldn't feel your fingers. But when searching for fossils at Siriuspasset, good light is really critical. And in recent expeditions, it might be luck, but we've had much better light. The downside is that that increasing grassiness and increased moisture has resulted in huge numbers of mosquitoes that we never used to get in that part of North Greenland. And there are days when, as it said in an old Arctic exploration account that I was reading a few days ago, the only way you could fit more mosquitoes into a cubic meter would be if the mosquitoes were smaller. And so that can be a bit unpleasant at times. But overall, stable sunny weather like this photograph would be my option every time. I mean, it's still only 4 degrees perhaps, but it's great weather for sitting and collecting fossils all day. In terms of the indigenous peoples, there haven't been any indigenous peoples this far north for quite some time. There are a few archaeological remains of Paleo-Inuit settlements. They were probably transient settlements dotted around the coast. They probably never came very far inland because that's not where the food was. So I'm not aware of any indigenous accounts of geology or of the paleontology.
Super. And sticking with fieldwork, 3 more short, sharp questions. Laura wants to know if you have to worry about polar bears. Morrison wants to know, how do you jacket or otherwise protect the specimens? Do you have to worry about the cold and for transportation? And then William asks, are some of these fossils from this expedition in the museum in Oxford?
Take the last one first. Yes, they are. Some are being studied. So there's some in my office, the Vetulicolians that I mentioned. And some were on display as part of First Animals, and you can see on the exhibition website. The main collections of Siriuspasset fossils are sitting in Copenhagen, in the National Museum of Natural History there. But they're really just being kept in stewardship, because the ultimate aim is to get them back to a museum in Greenland in the fullness of time. So all the material that we collect belongs to the geological to Greenland and the Greenland people and government, and that's where the material will go back, and that's where it should go back. Remind me of the other questions, Jack.
The other questions were, how do you protect the specimens for transport, and do you have to worry about the cold? And Laura wants to know, do you have to worry about polar bears?
Yeah. So in terms of protecting them from the cold, that's not so much of a problem. More of a problem is the fact they're reasonably fragile, so we do pack them very carefully, either by wrapping them in fabric and cardboard. John Peel had a really good system of taking up flat pack cardboard boxes and rolls of foam rubber, and we would then just put a layer of foam, layer of fossils, layer of foam, and then fill the box, tightly pack it down, and you could more or less kick those down the runway and the fossils would be undisturbed. In terms of polar bears, we've not been troubled by polar bears, but they do live there. I've seen them on the ice in JP Cock Fjord, that fjord in the background, from a helicopter, which is one of the best ways to see polar bears. But we do carry big guns, big high caliber rifles with us, and we keep them in the tents at all times just in case we're disturbed. Most recently, it's been wolves. Actually, wolves have begun to become more abundant in North Greenland, and there's a pretty active pack in Sirius Passet, but they keep out of our way. They're fairly shy for the most part.
And on to some questions about some particular specimens and the fossils themselves. We'll start with a question by Jiang, who asks, does Halkyria's two shell-like segments suggest a close affinity to brachiopods or bivalves, or is the resemblance superficial only?
So it's largely superficial. When Simon was first looking at it, that very first specimen, he came up with the lovely hypothesis that it was the missing link between brachiopods, annelid worms, and mollusks. We now know that they sit in very different parts of the animal evolutionary tree. But work by Jakob Winter, as part when he was a student, actually, a master's student, showed that Halkyria is a primitive mollusk. So the way that it's growing its shell is analogous to the way that clams or bivalves make their shell. So the two shells at either end are more similar to bivalve shells, but then they've got all these spicules in between that are part of this arm, or these sclerites, as we call them, that are part of the arm.
And Joe Botting wants to know, how similar are the assemblages from bed to bed?
Well, Joe Botting, the expert on Sirius Passet sponges, the man who was published on Sirius Passet sponges. So not an entirely naive question, Joe, thanks. They do vary quite a lot. So the overall species composition, we sampled at 10 centimetre intervals all the way through the section, just so we could do that census. And it's the same assemblage of species, but when it's a particularly high diversity interval, you just get the rarer elements coming in. So there's no particular gradation in the fauna from bottom to top.
And a nice open question from Mark Jacobs, who wants to know, what was your favourite find?
I suppose it would have to be Halkyria. I didn't say it during the lecture, but I more or less tripped over it, and so to pick that up and realise that we'd found a locality and we found a rather interesting fossil at the same time, I think that's one of the best moments of fossil discovery I've had in my career, actually.
We always like to hear about favourite fossils or favourite areas of geology. Moving on to some questions about trace fossils. I'll put two questions together here. Frederick would like to know, how can you tell that something is bilateral from its burrow shape? And Denver asks, are the evidence for animals through trace fossils in the Ediacaran still valid? As Mariotti et al. Have shown that microbial mats can form such tracks assumed to be made by animals.
Yeah, that was a neat, interesting paper. I think it's one of those instances where exceptional claims require exceptional evidence, and it is tempting to leap in older deposits, in Ediacaran deposits, and claim that things are made by animals. I think there are undoubted horizontal burrows in the late Ediacaran that we would all be very happy with. And if Frankie was speaking now, she would say, I think that there is some evidence that at least some of that Ediacaran biota was able to move and disturb the substrate as well. So yeah, there are definite, I think, from my perspective, definitely good evidence for burrows. There is good evidence for burrows in the top Ediacaran. In terms of the bilateral symmetry, it's the pattern of sinuosity and the fact that the burrow can deflect. That type of burrowing really depends on peristalsis, the swallowing action. As we push a bolus of food down our throat, that's peristalsis. And it's peristalsis that is only possessed by bilaterally symmetrical organisms that enables burrowing of that type. It's also, for what it's worth, probably what enables that primitive swimming that we see in some groups as well. So it's the evolution of peristaltic muscle movement is actually a key innovation in animals.
And Siddharth asks a question, which is, how can we calculate the age of the fossils? I'm going to be a bit more specific. How do we know the age of the fossils at Sirius Passet?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. Really good. And it's taken us a long time. It's much easier to describe a nice soft-bodied fossil than it is to try and work out the age. The biostratigraphy is difficult. That's partly because we can't use acritarchs, these small spores that we frequently use at this horizon, because the metamorphism, the rocks have been heated to a point where they've been burnt out. They're just carbon. The only thing that we can use is the trilobite Buonellus higginsii. But it's only known from Sirius Passet. So we've then got to take a series of steps to correlate Buonellus and its relatives across into more complete sections in central North America, where we've got more complete stratigraphy. So that's one way that we do it, but we can error check that, because what we can do is use the sequence stratigraphy, which is the record of sea level rise that's in the sediments. And the Sirius Passet fauna, I didn't particularly talk about it, is sitting right at the base of a major sea level rise. And that's a major sea level rise that we can take right the way across the North American continent and right the way across other continents as well. It's a very distinctive time-conforming horizon. And they both give the same answer, that it's essentially, Sirius Passet is the same age as Chengjiang and sitting at the base of Cambrian Series 3.
Okay, a few questions left, I think, and then we'll wrap it up. But really good one from Sarah. Why do you think the Cambrian explosion happened when it did?
So I think it was going to happen regardless. Everything was in place. My instinct is that what acts as the trigger for that real acceleration that we saw in the histograms is that sea level rise that I've just been talking about. For many tens to hundreds of millions of years, the inner parts of continents hadn't been flooded, and sea level sat at or below the edge of the continental margin. But for a variety of geological reasons, one of which is an increase in plate tectonic activity, that increases sea level globally, and it floods the interior of the continents for the first time. That increases the area in which organisms can live. Within a given depth of water on a slope, you're going to fit a small area. If you spill all of that water out across low gradient continental shelves, you've got a much bigger habitable area. And what ecologists know is that species diversity is pretty tightly linked to habitable area. So that sea level rise increases habitable area. That then provides the evolutionary driver to produce the Cambrian explosion, in my opinion.
And last but one question from William. Do you think we will ever have a Snowball Earth again?
Yes, but not for a while.
And therefore, to wrap it up, we go for the final question from Eleanor Straw, who asks, if you had unlimited funding, what would be the ideal place or thing for you to investigate to help you understand the Cambrian explosion?
I think what everyone would answer to that question is that we need more localities. We need them in other places. We need them in, so we've got them in Australia, we've got them in China, we've got them in North America. We've got some in Russia, but what we need is just more localities. Now, given my predilection for things Arctic, And with my unlimited funding, I would take a helicopter and hop my way all along the Buin Formation in North Greenland, because the Sirius Passet locality must occur in other places. And although we've looked in that small area around the locality and found a few bits, that outcrop belt, as we call it, that band of rock, extends for about 300 kilometers. So that's my fantasy helicopter trip.
Thank you so much for that final question, Eleanor, and we look forward to your donations towards Paul's field fund. Sorry to all the questions we couldn't get to. There were just so many, but we hope we'll see you back here in 2 weeks' time for our lecture with Professor Sarah Gabbett from the University of Leicester, who's going to be talking about experimental decay and the wonderful world of rotting fish, and what that tells us about fossils and preservation should be really, really exciting. So do join us in 2 weeks' time, and the link for that is up in the chat. But and do put your answer to the questions on the screen now in the chat. But from me at the museum and from Paul, thank you once again to Paul for a wonderful lecture, and we very much hope to see you again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.